You see, Jesus gives them a target to hit when he gives them this tactic of waking up and strengthening the things that remain. And he says, what I want you to do is I want to get you back on mission. I want to get you back on target. So this tactic is about hitting a target. So Jesus gives them a cheat sheet on the tactic that they need to execute to start moving from dead to alive. So what is the target for them? Jesus is saying that what has led them to be dead in their deeds is that their work was, watch this, incomplete. He doesn't say that their work was non-existent. He doesn't even say that their work was sinful. He doesn't say that their work was something that was shameful or something that they should be ashamed of. What Jesus says is that their work was incomplete. Jesus is showing us that this church just simply lost their way. They started what they did not finish, and they refused to finish what God told them to start. Their cycle of execution was not completed in the manner that Jesus would check the box off as a finished work. This church was suffering from what many of us would call mission drift. What is mission drift? Well, this phrase was popularized in the Christian nonprofit world by Peter Greer and Horst in their 2014 book, Mission Drift, The Unspoken Crisis Facing Leaders, Charities, and Churches. They studied organizations like the YMCA, Harvard, and ChildFund, organizations that began with explicitly Christian missions and over decades became entirely secular. Not because anyone set out to abandon the faith, but because small, well-meaning compromises started to accumulate. Mission drift, in definition, is the gradual, often unnoticed process by which an organization, a ministry, or a church, or even an individual slowly moves away from its original purpose, core values, or founding mission. It doesn't usually happen through one dramatic decision, but through a long series of, watch this, small compromises, shifting priorities, and accommodations that seem reasonable at the time, but are actually pushing us further and further away from the target. The tragedy of mission drift is that by the time anyone notices, the organization is still functioning, often successfully by outward means. Look, you look like they said you're alive, but you're dead, but is no longer doing what it is created to do, which is God's very definition of being dead. God's definition of the church of Sardis being dead is exactly this. They are still functioning, often successfully by outward measures, but is no longer doing what God has created it to do. They have a reputation of being alive because they are successful by outward measure. But in God, they are dead because they are no longer doing what they are created to do, no longer obedient to do what they were called to do. What are the stages of mission drift? Well, stage one is we have this clarity and conviction. The mission is sharp, it's specific, and it's deeply held. Everyone can articulate why it exists, and decisions are filtered through that purpose. There is a cost to holding the mission, and people pay it willingly. This is the first love stage. In order for there to be mission drift, there first must be a stage of all-out mission commitment. But then in stage two, we suddenly start softening. This is the accommodation stage. The mission has not changed on paper, but small compromises creep in. Language gets broadened. Hard edges get sanded down. We don't want to offend anyone, or we don't want to lead with the things that God called us to lead with because it's not bringing people through the door. We tell people that we still believe our mission, but we just don't need to harp on it as much or say it out loud. This isn't a place where people are lying about the mission, but the center of gravity of the mission is quietly moving in another direction. And then the drift starts to happen in practice. This is what they call the pragmatic stage, where decisions start being made for reasons other than mission. Decisions start being made for funding, for growth, for reputation, for efficiency, for keeping key staff happy, for avoiding controversy or getting into controversy. The mission statement still hangs on the wall, but it no longer drives the choices. It is used to justify choices that are made on the grounds. This is when leaders start saying, come on, guys, I know we said we were going to do that, but we have to be realistic. Or times have changed. This is where most organizations are living in mission drift without realizing it, that they are drifting away because the mission that God gave them no longer seems pragmatic. And even if they are still chasing the mission, they are trying to get to it another way because they want it to be easier. But then we get to the redefinition stage. This is what they call the rebranding stage. This is when the original mission starts to feel embarrassing because we can't pull it off. We keep telling people we're going to do this, but it's not happening, or it seems so juvenile. Everybody else is getting recognized for doing this, and we still over here caring about this. I'm embarrassed to have something that seems this shallow or this unpopular, or it starts to seem too narrow or outdated to the current leadership. So they rewrite the mission. The distinctives are removed. What was once the main thing becomes one of the many things, or it disappears entirely. After we rebrand, we fully depart from the mission. This is the abandonment stage. The organization is now doing something fundamentally different, and we have become something fundamentally different from what it was founded to be and what it was founded to do. It may still carry, watch this, the original name and some of the original vocabulary, but the actual work, the convictions and identity have moved somewhere else entirely. This part of the drift is usually irreversible without a full-scale refounding. Do you hear that? If you get to the full departure abandonment stage, then you are at the part of mission drift that is usually irreversible without a full-scale refounding. You've built so much false stuff on top of your real foundation. You may have even changed the foundation that you got to tear it all down to start again. And then if you haven't noticed you're in mission drift by full departure, the abandonment stage, you get into the justification and the hostility stage. Once an organization has fully drifted, it often becomes defensive about its new identity and even hostile to anyone who points back to the original mission. Those who remember what the organization used to be are labeled as backward or rigid or unloving. The drift is now just accepted and celebrated as maturity or growth. What are some warning signs that you and your organization, you and your church, you and your life may be in mission drift? Leaders stop being able to clearly articulate why the organization exists. They only can articulate what it does. The funding sources start shaping decisions more than convictions do. The board or leadership or elders no longer screen for mission alignment when hiring or selecting new leaders. They just pick up people who will willingly go along with what this new thing is. They start practicing cronyism and choosing people instead of people who are called. Distinctive language gets replaced with generic language that everyone can agree on. It's so general that we can't argue with it, but it has no specificity to it. Measurable outputs like attendance, dollars raised, programs offered, replace mission-faithful outcomes as the definition of success. And the founders or founding class, if they got a hold of what was going on, if they're not there any longer, or even if some of them are still there, the founders or the founding class would be uncomfortable with current decisions. But nobody is asking what those people would think. And then lastly, you may be in mission drift if success in the eyes of the world starts to matter more than faithfulness to the original call. We drift corporately because many of us are drifting or allowing ourselves to be pulled by those who have been drifting before us. We are drifting corporately because we're drifting in our prayer life. We are drifting corporately because we're drifting in our missional life. We are drifting corporately because we are drifting in our calling. And the scary thing about the drift is that we may never feel it happening because drifting does not require effort. Drifting is what happens when you stop rowing and you stop growing. So we need to ask ourselves, whether it be corporately or whether it be personally, what was I on fire for when I knew I was in the middle of my calling that I can barely remember caring about now? What are we on fire for as a church that when we knew we were in the center of God's will, we can barely remember caring about now? Then you could recognize that you were in your drift zone. And that is where Jesus is standing and calling you back.